In the spring of 1921, a man named Cornelius Stuyvesant walked into the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., and asked to see the 1890 federal census records for his family. He had a specific reason. His grandfather had owned land in upstate New York, land that had been contested in a probate dispute, and the 1890 census was the last official document that could place the family on that property before a series of suspicious title transfers in 1897. The archivist looked at him, paused, and then told him something that would take historians decades to fully understand. The records, she said, were gone. Not misplaced, not restricted. Gone. Cornelius asked how that was possible. The archivist explained that in January of 1921, the remaining 1890 census schedules held in the Commerce Department building had been destroyed by order of the federal government, authorized under a directive from the Census Bureau itself. Cornelius left that building without his evidence. The land dispute was settled against his family, and the 1890 census, the single most complete population and snapshot of America at the height of its most turbulent demographic transformation, ceased to exist as a retrievable record. What happened to the 1890 census is one of the most consequential archival events in American history, and it is also one of the least discussed. By 1890, the United States had completed its first full generation after the Civil War. The formerly enslaved population had spent 25 years building legal identities, acquiring land, registering births, and establishing churches that kept their own records, and in some cases accumulating property and wealth that rivaled that of their white neighbors. The children of Reconstruction, born free, had reached adulthood. Immigrants who had arrived in the 1860s and 1870s had naturalized, registered to vote, and established family lines and official records. Indigenous communities that had survived removal policies had begun to appear in census schedules in ways that documented their continued presence on lands that certain interests very much wanted to reclassify. The 1890 census captured all of this. It was the first census to use Herman Hollerith's punch card tabulation system, which meant it was also the most precisely organized, the most granular, and in many ways the most complete count of who actually lived in America and where they lived. And then it was destroyed. The official story is that a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building on January 10, 1921. The fire damaged a portion of the stored census schedules. The Census Bureau then determined that the water and smoke damage was so extensive that the remaining records were unsalvageable, and a formal destruction order was issued. Some accounts mention that census officials had already been recommending destruction of the 1890 records for years before the fire, arguing that the population data had already been statistically tabulated, and that the original schedules, which listed individuals by name, address, occupation, and property, served no further administrative purpose. What is less often mentioned is the timing. In 1921, the country was in the middle of one of the most aggressive periods of land consolidation and racial segregation in its history. The Great Migration was underway, moving hundreds of thousands of Black Americans northward, often because the land and legal standing their families had built in the South had been stripped from them through a combination of debt manipulation, fraudulent title transfers, and outright violence. The question of who had owned what land and when, and what names appeared in official records before certain transactions occurred, was not an abstract historical curiosity in 1921. It was an active legal and political battleground. The 1890 census was the single most powerful tool available to families trying to prove continuous presence, prior ownership, and legitimate heirship, and it was gone. I want to be careful here, because it is entirely possible that a fire did start in that basement, and it is entirely possible that the damage was as extensive as described. I am not claiming that someone deliberately set a fire to destroy census records. What I am saying is that the destruction was authorized, that it was not legally required, that alternative options such as transferring records to state archives or university libraries were not pursued, and that the population most harmed by the absence of those records was precisely the population that had the most urgent legal need for them at that exact historical moment. That is not a coincidence I can explain away. That is a pattern that requires examination. The 1890 census was not the only thing destroyed. To understand what was lost, You have to understand what the 1890 count actually contained. For the first time in American history, the 1890 census included a special schedule for Union veterans and their widows, which documented military service, pension eligibility, and family composition for hundreds of thousands of households. It included detailed questions about mortgage status, which for the first time created a nationwide snapshot of property debt, who held it, and on what terms. It asked about citizenship in ways that earlier censuses had not, which meant it created a detailed record of naturalization status for the massive immigrant populations that had arrived between 1870 and 1890. And it was the first census to enumerate the formerly enslaved population in a post-Reconstruction context, after the political gains of that era had already begun to erode. By 1890, Reconstruction was functionally over. The federal troops had withdrawn. The Redeemer governments had taken control across the South. And yet, the 1890 census still caught, in its final enumeration before the worst of the Jim Crow era, a snapshot of Black land ownership, Black community organization, and Black civic participation that no subsequent census would be able to replicate. Because by 1900, and certainly by 1910, the compression had already happened. The families that appeared in 1890 had by 1900 either moved, died, lost their land, or been reclassified in ways that broke the documentary chain. What does it mean to break a documentary chain? It means that when a family attempts to prove, in a court of law or a land office or a probate hearing, that their ancestor owned a particular piece of property, now they cannot produce the unbroken sequence of records that courts require. They have a deed from 1887 and a death certificate from 1903, but the census record that would have placed that ancestor on that land in 1890, living there, working it, paying taxes on it, is gone. The gap creates legal ambiguity. Legal ambiguity is resolved by courts. Courts in 1921 and in 1931 and in 1941 were not impartial institutions when it came to questions of Black land ownership, immigrant property rights, or indigenous territorial claims. The destruction of the 1890 census did not just erase names from a list. It erased the evidentiary infrastructure that entire communities needed to defend what was theirs. There is something else that is rarely discussed about the 1890 destruction, which is that it was not the first time federal census records had been treated as disposable. The original schedules for the 1800 and 1810 censuses were largely destroyed during the War of 1812, when British forces burned Washington. The 1890 fire followed a pattern in which the most politically sensitive counts, those taken during periods of maximum demographic and legal change, were the ones least likely to survive. The 1870 census, taken in the immediate aftermath of the 14th Amendment and the enfranchisement of Black men, was preserved but is riddled with documented undercounts in southern counties, where enumerators either failed to visit Black households or deliberately omitted them. The 1880 census survived, but is known to be incomplete for certain indigenous territories where enumerators did not enter. And the 1890 census, the most comprehensive, the most systematically organized, the one that used the most modern tabulation technology available, was the one that burned. How many people disappeared from the American record in January 1921? The 1890 census enumerated approximately 62.9 million people. Every single one of those individual schedule entries, the handwritten pages that recorded each person by name, by age, by race, by occupation, by birthplace, by citizenship status, by property ownership, was destroyed. What remained were the aggregated statistical tables that the Census Bureau had already published, numbers without names, totals without individuals, population counts without the human beings behind them. For genealogical research, for property disputes, for inheritance claims, for citizenship documentation, or the statistical tables were functionally worthless. You cannot take a statistical table into a probate court and argue that your grandfather lived at a specific address in a specific county and owned a specific piece of land. You need the schedule, you need the name, you need the page, and all of that was gone. The families that felt this most acutely were the ones already fighting the hardest battles. In the decades following 1921, Legal historians have documented hundreds of cases in which the absence of 1890 census records was cited explicitly as a barrier to resolving land disputes, pension claims, naturalization confirmations, and inheritance cases. Black families in the South who had been building cases against fraudulent land transfers since the 1890s found themselves unable to establish documentary continuity. Immigrant families in the Northeast trying to prove their fathers had naturalized before 1890, which would have automatically conferred citizenship on children born after that point, could no longer produce the corroborating evidence the census would have provided. Indigenous families attempting to demonstrate continuous habitation of treaty lands found that the one record that might have shown their grandparents living on those lands in 1890 no longer existed. And here is where I have to ask the questions that I cannot answer. Was the destruction of the 1890 census a deliberate act of archival erasure, designed to strip specific communities of the documentary evidence they needed to defend their legal rights at a moment when those rights were under maximum assault? Or was it a catastrophic combination of bureaucratic negligence, institutional indifference, and tragically bad timing that happened to produce the same effect as deliberate erasure? I genuinely do not know. What I know is that the outcome was identical in either case. 63 million Americans, many of them from the communities most vulnerable to having their identities, their land, and their legal standing stripped from them, disappeared from the navigable record. I know that the destruction was authorized by people who understood what those records contained. I know that no serious effort was made to preserve even a fraction of them. I know that the timing placed this destruction precisely at the moment when those records were most urgently needed as legal evidence. I know that no comparable record was ever reconstructed. And I know that the families who went looking for their grandparents in the pages of the 1890 census found nothing, and in finding nothing, often lost everything. If you have ever searched for a family member in the 1890 census and found only an empty search result, you are not alone, and you are not imagining the wall you have hit. If you have a deed or a letter or a photograph that suggests your ancestor was somewhere specific in 1890, but you cannot find a single official record to confirm it, that absence is not a failure of your research. It is the direct consequence of a decision made in 1921 by people who may or may not have understood what they were taking from you. If the name you are looking for should be there and is not, if the land your family talks about appears in no document you can find, if the dates in the records you do have refuse to line up in ways that make legal sense, there is a reason. There may be a record that was altered. There may be a family that was deliberately undercounted. There may be a transfer of identity, a name that was moved from one file to another, that you have not yet found the key to unravel. What happened to the 1890 census happened to millions of families at once, and the effects are still being felt in genealogical searches, in land disputes, in questions of inheritance and citizenship that remain unresolved to this day. Who decided that those 62.9 million individual records served no further purpose? Who determined that the water damage was too extensive to allow any preservation effort? Who authorized the final destruction order, and did they understand? Or did they choose not to understand what they were taking from the families who would spend the next 100 years looking for what was lost? If you have been searching for answers about your own family's history, and you keep running into records that do not add up, names that vanish from documents, land that belonged to your people and then somehow did not, you belong here. This channel exists for people who know that something was taken, even if they cannot yet prove it. You are not alone in this search, and the fact that the records are incomplete does not mean your history is. Subscribe, and we will keep looking together.